Hi everybody and welcome. Now if you're like me, the best gifts are the ones that you buy for yourself, and so here is a gift to me from me. It is the BFG9060. What is this? Well, it's a new accelerator card for big box Amigas, the A3000 and A4000, designed by Matza, otherwise known as Matthias Heinrichs, and the design created by him and then put on his Git site, and there is a long thread on the development of this card on the a1k.org Amiga site. This card incidentally was known for a lot of its development as the O60TK, standing for turbo card, and so you might see some references to the card with that name, but now is known as the BFG9060. We'll come to quite why it's called that in a minute. This particular card was built by Torsty76, so big shout out to Torsty. Thank you very much for building this card for me. There are other builders, by the way, also building this card who are on the A1K site, and I've also seen a couple of these cards already come out on eBay, so they are beginning to filter out into the wild, although sort of not in the mainstream just yet. But this is a brand new accelerator card for, as we can see down here from the massive socket, the 68060, and in fact the BFG9060 will also support the 68040 with the right modifications to the board itself to get the 040 to work. But it supports both, although I think mainly people are going to be putting 060s in the card. So let's take a quick walk around the board. So we've got the socket here, which you've got to find your own CPU for. More on that in a minute. But let's just move on around. We've got a handily placed header here for a fan. Why do you need a fan with an 060? Surely that's not necessary. Well, again, we'll come to that in a minute. There might be circumstances when you really do want to ensure your CPU is keeping cool. Up here we've got a flash ROM chip, which is really at this stage only used to ensure that you can boot under one of the traditional Kickstarts, sort of Kickstart 3.1 and below, because they do not support 060s with a floating point unit, so you need to turn it off using the flash ROMs. That's what that's for. We've got a couple of CPLDs that handle all the really clever stuff of interfacing with the CPU socket and with the various other chips, and they are programmed by firmware through the JTAG connector here. We'll talk a little bit more about firmware in a minute. Up here we've got a power supply area, and moving on around, we've got 4 RAM chips providing 128 megabytes of SD RAM, so really fast RAM. We'll look at that later. And these 2 chips here are level shifters to get the voltage levels right for this board. Also, as we come down to this section here, we've got a tiny little chip here which is barely visible, and a little header which is providing an I2C connector. Why? What's that picking up? Well, a 68060 has an inbuilt temperature measurement thermometer in it, so you can read that off using the I2C connection, and also the voltages that the CPU is getting via I2C, and output it at this little header here. And this is the reason why, if you saw my other video about I2C cards on the Amiga, that's why I got that card, was to be able to read out the temperatures and voltages of the 060. Couple of other things about the capabilities of this card. It can handle DMA, so that is going to make it a lot easier for those device controllers, hard disk controllers that use DMA and the like, and it can also support Move 16 burst instructions, so for those bits of software that use that. Now At this stage, however, the firmware on the CPLDs is still at a relatively early stage, so there are some things that are not quite there at the moment. Two of those, just to begin with, are the fact that this card doesn't seem to quite work properly with machines that have a Super DMAC chip on them that they're using to access hard disks. So what do I mean? Well, really it's the A3000, A3000T. If you're using the onboard SCSI, then this card does not play nicely with that, so you've got to find another solution for accessing SCSI. Second thing is this card does not currently support vectored interrupts, which are supposedly used on the A4091. Now, I must confess, don't ask me what vectored interrupts are and whether the 4091, excuse me, really does or doesn't use vectored interrupts. I don't know. The only thing to say is this card doesn't support that directly. What it does support, however, is controlled by these two jumpers here, which are for controlling the clock speed. So as I've got it set up at the moment, it's in its default configuration, you might say, and that will run the CPU at 50 megahertz. But by setting different jumper settings, I can set the clock rate to 75 or 100 megahertz. Now, there's a few things to say about that. At the moment, the current generation of the firmware, at the time I'm recording this video, does not support 75 megahertz, and I think that's because it is a sort of odd multiple of the system bus, which is 25 megahertz. So there's some timing issue going on at 75 megahertz. Apparently an early version of the firmware did support 75 megahertz, so hopefully in time 75 will become a possibility. So what we're left with is 50 or 100 megahertz. But then, you know, 100 megahertz, that is a massive overclock for the CPU, and the A60, which I think only came top speed of 66 megahertz, was that, for the full version. So you're overclocking by a long way, and hence the need for a fan or some sort of cooling system, which is probably a fan, probably active cooling via the fan header. Final thing to say is that I've seen some reports, again with the current version of the firmware that's on the CPLDs, that LC chips, the ones without the FPU, again don't like overclocking. And I guess the other thing I should say is, actually, if you're going to run an O60 at 100 megahertz, almost certainly that's going to require the Rev 6, the final version of the O60, to work properly, which is the final version with no known errors on the chip, but also one that runs cooler than the previous versions, so is able to take the 100 megahertz, or at least have the potential to run at 100 megahertz more than the earlier revisions. Whether it can or not, time will tell. So that's the board itself. What about the CPU? Because we've got to fit that here. Let's look at that next. So here's my lovely O60 CPU, a Rev 6. I bought this a while ago now, when I could see that the BFG card was in the process of being developed, that actually it'd be a good idea to have a Rev 6. It is a genuine Rev 6. At the time I got it, it seemed ferociously expensive, way more than I was hoping to have to pay for it, and since then prices have only got even higher, to the point where true Rev 6 are really difficult to come by. I'm afraid it is what it is with those chips, they are in demand. Anyway, now has come the time to fit this, I think. And what we can see just before I try and do that is there is a particular pattern of pins here on the socket that means this chip will only fit one way round. So you know, really critical to check which way that is, but that means it's actually rotated at 90 degrees so that the designation of the chip is top left here. So now we have the job of just locating all those pins. I don't know if you can see that. I'm just trying to very carefully, because I don't want to bend anything while I'm pushing this in, fit this chip, and that is quite a tight fit actually. Okay, it's not quite what I wanted to happen. She's going in one corner, not the other corner. There we are. Right, that's all the way home. I mean, with something so sort of now rare and delicate, you do not want to mess that up. So that's why that took a little moment or two, but that's the CPU in place. The other thing, because my ambition here is to get this overclocked, is cooling. So I managed to get hold of a nice little CPU fan, which has got a heatsink on it as well. It's quite low profile, so I'm hoping that will be short enough to fit in the case. And then you can see that I have had to remove the original fan header here and put on a sort of a larger 3-pin fan header, so that can connect directly into the fan socket. Helpfully, this fan seems to have come with a thermal pad on it already, so let's see if I can remove the backing tape for that, and then it's just a matter now, how am I going to do this? Putting that down on the chip, and I want to arrange this so that these lugs are not going to interfere with anything. I think I'm actually going to rotate it around like that. That's better. Yeah, what occurred to me is if I had the lug sticking out over here, I might not be able to fit it inside the case of the Amiga. So that's that, and then I can just slot that in, power it there, that's it. And so that is all arranged. So there we are, the whole card ready to rock and roll in the Amiga. Now, before I put the BFG card into the machine, I wanted to show you what machine I'm actually going to use, and it's this, the AA3000 Plus that you've seen on previous videos. But you might be wondering, why on earth is this looking scattered like it's in the middle of some sort of post-mortem with all its guts trailing all over the desk? Well, a couple of reasons for that. First of all is good access to where the CPU card is down here, so I can take that in and out as I need to. But the other side of it is this little problem that there seems to be with the current version of the firmware for the BFG, which is that it won't run off the internal Super DMAC drives. It won't interact with those properly without causing problems on the drive. So I've had to take out the SCSI to SD card out of there and copy it all across onto this compact flash card here, which is running off a Buddha card in the Zorro slot. So quite a lot of moving around just to get this thing in a state where it'll boot up okay, that's not a problem, and I can get access to the innards to change over the card. Now, talking of cards, the CPU card that's in here already is my trusty CyberStorm Mk2, and I thought it would be quite interesting to do some benchmarks comparing the BFG against this card because it's in the machine already. So what I'm going to do is run some benchmarks before and after, so to speak, and then we can compare the results and just see how the BFG does against a sort of a graphics card, sorry, a CPU card from back in the day. But let's just run which Amiga before we do that, because this will give us an indication of clock speed, just to make sure I'm not cheating anything. So it's a full 060 in the CyberStorm Mk2, 50 megahertz, but it is a Rev 1 060, so perhaps that's something that we'll have to take into account as we're interpreting some of the benchmarks. Rev1 has some erratas in it, in other words, errors in the way the chip was put together. So some operations don't perform as they were intended, but they therefore need to be worked around, which is slower than inherently a Rev6 can do, where there are no errata and the CPU operates as intended. But you know, for example, let's just do a quick bus test on this chip and card and just see how that gets on. So you can see that our fast memory reads something like 33 megabytes per second, excuse me, and the equivalent writes are something about 23 megs a second. So not bad for a CyberStorm Mk2, but you know, what can we achieve with the BFG? Similarly, what other benchmarks can I pull together quickly just to get a sense of pace of this card that I can compare against the BFG? So I think let's do a cut here and join me again in a while after I've done all the benchmarks on the CyberStorm. So all the benchmarks are finished running, so now is the time to switch over the CPU cards. So out with the CyberStorm, and I think the first thing to do here is to disconnect that fan and then just pop this out very carefully. There we go, and out with the CyberStorm. Now before putting the BFG in here, I think there's at least one thing we need to pay attention to, and that's the jumpers, which on this motherboard are over here for setting the various clock speeds, etc. And as with any add-in accelerator for the A3000 or A4000, you've got to get those jumpers right. Otherwise, basically, you just get a black screen at startup, and then you wonder why and scratch your head for ages. And quite often, it's those jumpers. So for the BFG card, we need jumper 100, which is here on this motherboard, set to 25 megahertz. Certain A3000s have 16 megahertz set here, or even external set here. We want 25 megahertz, which is pins 1 to 2, which is what it's on. Jumper 102, which is this one here, set to internal as well, which is jumpers 2 to 3. Again, it's already set on that. And jumper 104 set on CPU clock, again internal. Sorry, that is CPU clock, set it to internal, which is 1 to 2, again already set on that. So this is already set up how it needs to be. There's one other jumper, jumper 103, which is down here on this motherboard, which is controlling the FPU. Apparently that needs to be set to enable onboard FPU, which is this chip here, by jumpers 3 to 4, which again it already is. So that's all set up on this machine already, but I might have to switch those around if I was changing from a different accelerator or something. Jumpers 102, 103 I don't think actually exist on the 4000, or at least some of them. So don't go looking for those if you can't immediately find them, because they may not actually be there on the board. But that's that. So now I can get the accelerator card and sort of position it in place. What I am going to do though is make sure that I get these I2C cables round and sorted out. So now I need to make sure I've got these the right way around, SDA is on the left here, and SDA for me is this red cable, so that needs to go on there, and orange on SCL there, and that's right. And then very carefully just position this over the CPU connector and a bit of downward pressure. There we are. Right. One thing you might notice actually is just how much smaller the BFG is than the CyberStorm, which really does take up the whole sort of bay here in the A3000. The BFG, that bit smaller, and you know, again, just look at the different complexities of the boards. Really, the CyberStorm dominated by all those SIM slots, whereas they're all compressed into 4 chips here on the BFG, and really that probably accounts for a lot of the tidiness of the BFG. And of course, lots of support chips going on here for the CyberStorm that aren't necessary for the BFG, I guess because CPLDs have just moved on in the intervening time. Anyway, that ought to complete the setup of the BFG. Now it's just time to turn it on and hope it all works. So let's power on and wish me luck. Well, the fans come on, so that's a good start. Power lights come on. You probably can't see, but the hard drive light there is just blinking because the it's trying to access the onboard SCSI, which of course doesn't do anything right now, and the floppy drive just clicked, so that's showing signs of life. Let's just give it a moment to go through its startup process, and we've got something on screen. For some reason my output at the moment on native screens coming out very dim, so apologies for that, but the RTG looks fine. And hey, here we are. We are into Workbench. So let's just run a Which Amiga and see what we've got here. So it's found my Rev 6. It's running at 50 megahertz, FPU and MMU. That all seems to be doing absolutely fantastic. And oh look, it's recognized new board a1k.org community unknown product ID number 60, which must be my BFG card, because the boards.library, I think it is, that describes all these expansion boards hasn't been updated, or at least I haven't updated my version yet to have the BFG card in it. Fantastic. Looks like we've got some progress here. So let's just run some quick tests. Bus test fast. Let's just see what we get. And already that is a lot faster, isn't it? I think for read L we got about 32.7 megabytes per second, didn't we? On the CyberStorm, this is doing 49, getting on for 50 megabytes a second. So that is great progress. The other one that will be good to test is simple sensors. Oh, now wait a minute, that's not going to work, because what I need to do is move the configuration file across, which at the moment is in storage. I need to set up the configuration file for the BFG, which is this one, I think. Let's just check that. Okay. Configuration file for the TK060 or the BFG9060. Yeah, so that's us. So that's the one I want, and I want to put that into devs sensors, wherever that is. There we go. So shove that in there. And now if I do simple, let's just see what that comes up with. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Let's just come to the front. Right, have a look at all of that. So 7 voltage sensors, 6 temps, 2 fans. So we've got lots of voltage stuff here. Still showing 2.5 volts on VCC, both VCC readings. If you saw my other video about that, I had that weirdness last time round as well. But my 5 volt reading 4.78, yeah, sounds about right. 3.3, V3.3 and V core both bang on 3.3 volts, and that's really encouraging. This voltage reading 4.7, so I guess that's 5 volts as well, and my 12 volt reading just a little bit over 13 as a matter of fact. And then lots of temperatures. Now let's ignore the max 31760 because I'm not exactly sure what they're measuring, but I think what we've got here is some temps off the motherboard and the two LTC2990 chips, and importantly the core temperature of the A3000, which at the moment is just, let's call that 40 degrees. As it's been running for a few seconds while I've been speaking, let's just run that again and see what it's up to. So actually very similar temperature, so that's okay. I need to invest a little bit more time in understanding what all these different results are, but that's looking pretty encouraging, particularly as my VCC voltage is now where it should be, close to 5 volts. Ignore these fan readings whilst the I2C card I've got supports a fan. There aren't any fans plugged in, so ignore the fact that it says 45 RPM. Anyway, I think now is the time for me to get on and do all of those benchmarks that I did for the CyberStorm, repeat them all on the BFG at 50 megahertz. And then I'll be back and we can test out the BFG at 100 megahertz. Right, let's run a quick sysinfo speed test just for old times' sake. Well, how about that? 2.06 times faster than an A4000. Let me just keep a note of these results. So 37608 dry stones, 2.06. And what we'll do is we'll test the drive speed here. In all honesty, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference because it's all going to be controlled by the Zorro 2 bus. But anyway, why not? Right. Come out of that. And let's also just test it's working okay with the DSP processor. So 3.1 seconds for, just try that again. So 3.1, and is the DSP working? Yes, it is beautifully. 3.23, so very similar speeds. This is a benchmark called Boxy, which was discussed in an EAB thread where a user called Para, P-A-R-A-J, sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, but Para was talking about how to optimize texture mapping on a 68060. So he wrote this program called Boxy just to test that, and it's just a different way of running a benchmark because it spits out some quite useful information, as you can see there, for exactly how fast it's running, but highly optimized for the A3000. So that will prove quite a helpful test. Let's have a look at that old stalwart Quake. See, I've been doing loads of stuff here, so let's get rid of all of that and run Quake and give that a go and see what results we get. It's being a bit slow to load just because I'm running off this Zorro 2 based Buddha into a compact flash. Anyway, try and just do one thing at a time. So let's concentrate on that. Not quite sure why the screen's getting chopped off on the left. That's a bit irritating, isn't it? while we run through the familiar time demos here, I mean, just a thing to say is what I'm looking for here is the relative performance of the two different accelerated cards, but also doubling the clock speed. What difference does that make? It's not so much the absolute speed. I'm sure there are tweaks that I could do to my setup, you know, particle effects, all that kind of stuff that would boost the FPS. It's more what difference does the accelerator itself make, and that will be influenced as much as anything by the RAM speed, but also changing the CPU clock speed. What difference does that make? Seems to be running reasonably well, I must admit, even at 50 megahertz as we are now. It sort of stutters a little bit, but I mean, wow, back in the day you'd have been absolutely overjoyed with this kind of pace, wouldn't you? Okay, so that was the first time demo. Let's just make a note of that, 12.2 FPS. And carry on. And after all that testing, let's just have a quick look at where we are on temps. Core temp 43 degrees, and the other temperatures which are measuring variously, the chips and the motherboard, also around the 40-degree mark. It continues to be a heat wave here, so it's pretty warm in the room, the sort of ambient temperature here pretty warm, and so these kind of temperatures are not that surprising, and the CPU has been working pretty hard, so all very good, keeping it nice and cool. But this is still only 50 megahertz, so the question is, what happens when we come switch it over to 100 megahertz? I think we should look at that right now. Alright, so now comes the fun bit of switching this card over into 100 megahertz mode. I'm skipping 75 megahertz because it doesn't seem to work properly with the version of the firmware that's on this machine, on this card right now. So straight to 100 megahertz. It's all controlled by these two jumpers down here, which are labeled S0 and S1, and apparently all I've got to do is take the S1 jumper and move it to the other pair of pins like that, and that should do it. So let's hope this works. Wish me luck. Let's power on. Okay, the fan is running. The drive light is flickering a little bit, and let's just switch over to what's on screen so you can see it at the same time as me. So far blackness, but that's not unusual for this machine. And we sit and wait. Something completed set patch. Excellent. So the thing is actually working. Would you look at that? We're into Workbench. Fantastic. So let's run which Amiga and just prove that this actually has changed the clock speed. 100 megahertz Rev 6. How about that? Awesome stuff. Love it. Right. Let's therefore start running some tests and just see how this thing performs. So back to my favorite bus test just to kick us off. Let's see what that comes up with. So 7593 megabytes a second. Oh wow, that is so much faster in the internal memory. But of course, you know, that's the whole point. It's now running on modern memory, very limited weight states, so it's running maybe not quite flat out, but about as fast as the A3000 can manage. Let me just take a quick pic of all of that because I don't want to lose these benchmarks. And let's just check what we're showing for temperatures, because that was the whole point of doing all of this thing. So the T core, so to speak, the core temperature, that bit higher, 47.9, let's call it, down to 46 now. So it looks like maybe it heats up quite a bit while the CPU is doing quite a lot, and then cools down. It's just jumping about, isn't it? Okay, don't read too much into it. Not quite 50 degrees, so that's fine so far, but you know, let's have a look at some other stuff. And why not this time? Let's have a look at Quake. Let's get that going and do those time demos. And see what we get. Come on, unknown code. Oh, I can't type. Okay, time demo 1. That's better. And that seems a lot more. Wow, that seems a lot more sparky. Crikey. Yeah, I'm sure you can notice the difference as much as I can. And that's that done already. Wow. 17.7. And come out of there. And I think what we ought to do is just run that test again. And we're only up to 49 degrees, so that is very pleasant indeed to see that the temperature hasn't risen that much. Fantastic. Right, close some windows and let's look at some other stuff. Where have I got it? Sysinfo, yeah, come on, let's have a look at that. So, speed. .12 times an A4000, love it. And just test the DSP is working okay. Well, and actually just how fast it is to do this. So 2 seconds. 1.99. Well, yeah, we can argue about the hundredth of a second there. But how fast does the DSP take? 2.89. So doubling the clock speed of the FPU has meant that running it on the A60 is now materially faster than the DSP, which of course is still running at 50 megahertz. All right, I'm going to carry on running a bunch of other benchmarks. So I will be back after all that's done and we can start pulling this all together. One last little check of the temperatures. And we're still under 50 degrees, which is just fantastic. Bearing in mind, I've got the case off at the moment. I suspect in real world conditions with the case back on, that's going to be a little bit higher than that. Anyway, leave it to me and I'll be back with some benchmarks. Well, the benchmarking is done and the results are in. And what we're going to look at is a series of benchmarks across the 3 different configurations I've got on the screen here right now. So we're going to look at the CyberStorm Mk2 060 with its Rev 1 processor running at 50 megahertz clock speed, and compare that against the BFG card with its Rev 6 060 running first at 50 megahertz and secondly at 100 megahertz. And the reason I've done it like that is so that we can compare the 2 different accelerators on the same clock speed and then see what difference it makes to double the clock speed. Now, before we go into the details of all of that, actually, I wanted to share with you a set of strange results that only became apparent after I'd finished doing all of the benchmarking runs. And it all comes down to the cache read speed reported in sysspeed. So just to explain the figures on the screen here, the CyberStorm 50 megahertz is reported by sysspeed as having a cache read speed of, let's call that 190 megabytes per second. Running the BFG card at 50 megahertz also, same test, sysspeed, cache read speed, 2.5 megabytes per second. That just cannot be right. And this difference caused an awful lot of head scratching, and I must say it took the aid of a couple of other BFG owners, Trickster and Pillock, to help me understand exactly what was going on. And the answer is that you need to turn on Mu-Fast-ROM, which relocates the ROM into RAM and then patches that using the MMU, so all the calls to ROM actually end up in fast RAM, and the exact command line is the one at the bottom there, Mu-Fast-ROM protect on. And if you add that in early on in your startup sequence or run it from the command line and then run sysspeed, look at the BFG results, suddenly back to what the CyberStorm was getting, 190 megabytes per second, we get the same answers. Now, why is it that Mu-Fast-ROM suddenly changes the results for sysspeed's cache reading speed? It's not at all obvious to me why mapping the ROM into RAM changes the apparent cache read speed. I've asked around to get ideas on why this is the case, and no one seems to really have a convincing answer, at least in my opinion. Many other accelerator cards seem to deliver the right answers, you might say, the CyberStorm type figures, without having to use Mu-Fast-ROM, even when their own internal ROM is disabled. Their internal ROM, of course, might do something similar to Mu-Fast-ROM as part of the startup process when you turn the machine on. So you may not be obvious that it's mapping the ROM somewhere else, but even if you turn off the accelerator cards on board boot ROM, still you don't get very low cache read speeds. So it's not at all clear why this is the case with the BFG, certainly at the time I'm recording this. But here's the thing. Do the Mu-Fast-ROM protect on and you don't have to worry about it. You get consistent results. So having worked all of that out, I redid all the benchmarking results all over again, and what we're going to look at now is on the basis of Mu-Fast-ROM being turned on. So let's start with CPU speed. I've got some figures here from sysinfo and sysspeed. Left-hand column is the CyberStorm at 50 megahertz, and the right-hand column, the BFG, also at 50 megahertz. You look down the list, and those results, within the tolerance you can measure them at, are the same. And that's a good thing. You wouldn't really expect these kinds of tests to show up any difference when the clock speed of the A3000 is exactly the same. So that's good. That shows, by the way, that the BFG is performing exactly as you would expect it to. But then you double the clock speed for the BFG and you get the third column of results. And what I've done is to express that as a delta. In other words, a comparison between BFG at 50 megahertz and BFG at 100 megahertz. And so here a delta of 100% means the 100 megahertz figure is twice as fast as the 50 megahertz figure. So you look down the rows and you see each of them has a delta of 100%. Doubling the clock speed has doubled the measured CPU performance. Again, that's exactly what you would expect, because these tests are only really testing the CPU's internal innate speed. So all very good and all very interesting, but let's get on to some real results that affect how it feels to actually use the machine with these accelerators in. So let's look at memory speed. You saw me running some of these tests. In the left-hand column, is the CyberStorm 50 megahertz, and then we've got the BFG also at 50 megahertz. And you can see here the delta here is between those two cards. The BFG is considerably faster. On long reads, it's 50% faster than the CyberStorm, half as much again at doing that, and on the write speed it's twice as fast. So memory access on the BFG considerably faster than the Phase 5 card. Now let's add in the figures when we double the clock speed, and look at the far right hand column, and here at 100 megahertz we're 90% faster again. Remember, this is against the BFG at 50 megahertz. So compared to the CyberStorm, we're considerably faster, aren't we? We're almost 3 times as fast on the BFG 100 megahertz. And that much faster memory access speed starts affecting some of the other results when we start measuring how real-world applications actually feel in operation. More on that in a minute. Let's just keep going with some of the more basic tests. And the next one was Mandel DSP. This is the DSP program that produces those Mandelbrot pictures. I wanted to test this one simply to see how the BFG CPU interacted with the onboard DSP chip on the A3000 Plus motherboard. The 2 rows here, one is when the FPU is doing all the calculations, nothing to do with the DSP at all, and the second one is where the DSP is doing the heavy lifting on the floating point calculations. Now the interesting set of results here, look in the middle, is that first set of deltas. Actually the BFG is a bit slower than the CyberStorm at this particular program, even though they're on the same clock speed. Why is that? I must confess I'm not entirely sure, but that's what the figure showed. It is noticeably a little bit slower. But if you double the clock speed of the BFG, then you get a big increase again. Not surprisingly, that's more apparent when the FPU is doing all the hard work. But even when it's the DSP doing some of the calculations, you still get a speed boost from the core CPU running faster. Let's move on and look at another application, and this time our old favorite Quake. I was running this in 640 by 480 at 16 bits per pixel. Again, it's not so much the absolute frame rates here that are important, but it's the relative differences. So you've got the 3 different demo runs in the original Quake there, but actually the figures are relatively similar between them all. The BFG at 50 megahertz is 5 to 6% faster. I guess that comes down to that much faster memory access. If you double the clock speed, you get another 43 to 51% boost. Interesting that not all of the clock speed boost comes through in the figures for the BFG at 100 megahertz. I'm assuming that's because some of the time it takes to render the frame is taken up by the RTG card actually doing all the drawing of pixels, and doubling the clock speed of the CPU doesn't make any difference to how long it takes the graphics card to draw a pixel. But you do get a speed boost. Let's keep going. What about some real-world tests? Well, I ran a whole heap of Picasso 96 speed tests. I'm just showing 2 results here, being the top 2 rows here. Put text there. The figure's a little bit disappointing for the BFG card. It came with a lower score at a like-for-like clock speed. We're showing it was slower by almost 7%. If you double the clock speed again, however, you get 5 of that -7 back again, but you still at 100 megahertz. The BFG is a little bit slower than the CyberStorm at 50 megahertz. Not entirely sure why that's the case, but that's what Picasso 96 speed came up with. Conversely, here's another test, the bit map rast port call, which is considerably faster even at 50 megahertz in the BFG, 17%. and another 55% faster on top if you double the clock speed to 100 megahertz. What does that mean? Well, it means that depending on exactly what you're using your accelerator for with BFG9060, the actual real world feel might be a bit different. If you're putting a lot of text on the screen, then the BFG is not likely to feel that as fast as the CyberStorm, but if you're doing splitting bitmaps, it's going to feel that much quicker. Then we have Boxy at the bottom there, which was that test of texture mapping. This is a bit more like testing a demo. Again, a negative score for the BFG at 50 megahertz. It was almost 20% slower than the CyberStorm. But if you double the clock speed, then you get all that back and more, and suddenly we're at considerably faster at almost 48 frames per second. On to the final set of results, and I was just curious to do this test of exactly how fast the compact flash card on my Buddha IDE interface would work with the different accelerator combinations. And actually, I must admit, I wasn't expecting it to make any difference at all, because the Buddha not only runs on the Zorro bus, but is a Zorro 2 card. And I just assumed that the speed of access to the drive would be limited by the speed of Zorro 2, but that's not actually what the results show. If you look at the first set of deltas, the BFG is almost the same speed as the CyberStorm at 50 megahertz on the write file test, but it's just a little bit faster on the read file test, almost 9% faster. And if you double the clock speed, you can wring just a little bit more performance out of the BFG combination. It's there, just got its nose in front of the CyberStorm on write file test, and has managed to get over 2 megabytes a second on the read file test. So, you will see a very modest improvement in IDE speed using the BFG when you overclock it. Actually, is it going to change your life? No, probably not. At 2 megabytes per second, that is still not very fast, and there are other faster solutions available. Of course, we all know that Zorro 2 is inherently not the fastest bus on the Amiga. So put all the different benchmark results together. What do you take out of it? Well, first of all, doubling the clock speed on the BFG clearly makes a big difference. We'd expect that. That's the reason we're doing it in the first place. Secondly, the very fast RAM access on the BFG card does make a considerable difference in some applications if they are memory access intensive. That is a big positive, but it does depend on the application you're using, and you get some of that boost even at 50 megahertz. But there are circumstances in which the BFG card, particularly when it's running at the same clock speed as the CyberStorm, is a little bit slower than that card. And again, it depends on the circumstances. But there are other things in real world life where the BFG's memory access speed and higher clock speed when you overclock it do make a difference. So to summarize, it all depends exactly what you're using your Amiga for, but this certainly looks like a very interesting and capable card, and one particularly with its RAM access speed and overclockability that will have a lot of interest for the enthusiast community. So what's my overall assessment of this card? Well, I think it's absolutely fantastic. In summary, it's a modern card, relatively easily available, and at a much cheaper price than some of the accelerator cards that were available back in the day. The challenge is going to be getting hold of an A3000, just because their popularity has meant prices are now sky high. But if you happen to have one, this is a great addition for your Amiga. It's easy to set up, and as we've seen, easy, certainly with a Rev 6 A60, to push it to 100 megahertz. You do need some active cooling for that though. I'm hoping in time the firmware gets tweaked further so that you can run at 75 megahertz. That might be a solution for the Rev 5s out there, and also support 4LC processors, which are a lot cheaper than the full fat version that is running here. The addition of the I2C header, a really neat idea. I really like that, just to keep an eye on the processor. Is it absolutely necessary? Probably not. And certainly I think some people who are building these boards don't include the sensor chip in the build. So if you're going after one of these, you need to check whether that's included or not. I think the other thing, just from an overall design point of view, is this is just the accelerator and the memory, and therefore what it lacks is any form of fast IDE or SCSI port on it. That would have made the card even better, but I think, you know, there are other solutions to that if that's a concern for you. But personally, I'm okay without that. I can live with slower drive access speeds. It's really the processing that I'm more interested in. Your views may differ. Overall, fantastic card. My hat off to Matthias Heinrichs for producing this. Absolute fantastic work. You deserve a medal from the Amiga community, to be honest, for producing this. And I know there are other accelerators that are similar in design. Really hoping to get my hands on one of those when they come out and maybe compare it with this. But for now, this really is very welcome for the Amiga community. Thank you very much, Matzo, and all the beta testers. Torsti, the builder of this particular card. Trickster also, shout out to you. Thank you for helping me with the setup of everything, make sure this worked. Absolutely love this BFG. That's it for this video. Catch me again next time. Bye for now.